According to the Society of Human Resource Management, SHRM for you acronym types, 1 out of 7 Americans do not feel safe at work. I did not think I would ever do this podcast, much less this early in my relationships at work run. But we actually have our guest mention active shooter today. We're talking about workplace violence, and it gets interesting. Stick around. It's Relationships at Work, the Employee Experience and Workplace Culture podcast. I'm Russel Lolliker, and thank you once again for the joining of me. Before we get into my lead up to the show, I do want to recommend you check out us on LinkedIn. That's right, we've got our very own page, company page. It's not really kind of a company. It's still Relationships at Work podcast, which you can find on LinkedIn. You'll see great information from former guests, articles on improving the employee experience, some ways of thinking differently, such as a recent post that leaders really need to start thinking about the middle, not the 10% rock stars, the bottom 10% problems, but that middle that could be the lifeblood of your organization if you don't ignore them. Anyway, thoughts like that might get your brain thinking a little bit differently. Just check us out over at LinkedIn, Relationships at Work podcast. We'd love to have you. Now, as I said off the top, I didn't think I would be doing this podcast. I had no idea of the world that we live in sometimes. I mean, because truthfully, it's not really my experience. And we're talking about workplace violence. And violence isn't just fighting, like physically punching and kicking. It's a lot more to it. And that made a little bit more sense to me. But we're going to talk to our guest today who's knee deep in this, and he's been doing this for decades, so he knows of what he's talking about. And of course, we're going to be talking about the American side of it because that's where our guest is from, and that's more his experience. But there's certainly some things we can think about internationally because we're all people. And even though it might be more prevalent in some countries more than others, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that we don't have to make efforts to prevent it. We have to have empathy and compassion and understand the people that we work with. But it's also not that easy. And our guest is going to dig into a lot of different buckets for us to pour our brains into. Here we go. On the show today, we have Felix Nater, and here is why he's awesome. He's a workplace violence prevention advisor and consultant, and the president of owner of Nater Associates Limited. And that is a human resources security management consulting practice. Felix, well, he's had 3 decades plus, we can put a plus in there, of federal law enforcement, investigative, program management, and security experience as a United States Postal Inspector, special investigator, and postal police officer. He's also a retired Army Reserve Sergeant Major. He has got a lot of knowledge and a lot to talk about, and I'm not the only one that's been interested to hear what he has to say. He's appeared on CNN, New York One, ABC Business News, Channel 9, Long Island News, History Channel. The man has words and things to share, and I'm excited to have him on the show. Hello, Felix.
Hello, Russell. You really build me up, don't you? Thank you. Absolutely.
It's a good launching pad to start the conversation.
It sure sounds like it. I hope I can deliver.
Of course. Now, Felix, I'm so interested in our topic today of violence in the workplace. But first, I wanna sort of tap into your experience personally when it comes to the employee experience and workplace culture. What's your best or worst, one or the other, sir, employee experience you've had?
I'm going to answer it this way by saying, I gotcha. It's a combination of both. It was a young lady who was a victim of an infatuation in the workplace situation that escalated to a point of imminent threat of bodily harm. And on the day that we were authorized to enter the person's premises to place him under arrest for the threats made, we entered his apartment. and on the kitchen table were a bunch of candles, almost like an effigy, and then an artist's portrayal or rendition on the wall of the young lady and he holding hands ascending to heaven. We interviewed him. He immediately admitted that the next stage of his intentions was to take out the young lady, and since she didn't want to be his boy girlfriend, he was going to end her life, end his life, and live that out in heaven. So that's the best and worst, in that we were able to prevent that from happening, and the worst scenario that I've ever experienced in my postal inspector career.
How does that impact you as someone on the outside looking in at someone who's reacting such in a way? I mean, that's at the end of the day, that is your employee experience. That is, how does that impact you personally? Like taking that home.
I never looked at it from the perspective of it being my employee experience, Russell, but you hit the nail on the head. So from that point on, I emphasized the need for me to be responsive to every single employee complaint or situation that involved a threat, intimidation, a verbal situation, in order to prevent the escalation and to swiftly get at the root cause of the problem. So it impacted me from the standpoint of really assuming the importance of being proactive and responsive in situations of that kind.
I can't imagine how I guess almost scared it would impact you to know that it can get that bad and it can go that far, that it would motivate you to be more dedicated to your work. Um,
Yes.
just, yeah, out of fear of this could actually happen.
Yes. And the learning extraction that I share with my audiences and in my consulting and advisory services is you want to be able to take a witness stand and never have to fabricate or lie about your reporting or your observations or the decisions that you made. And by being responsive and proactive and learning from those experiences, you have no reason to lie if your intentions were honorable, and you have no reason to be deceptive if the reporting was factual. So I use those experiences to share with my clients of the benefit to be derived by implementing programs, by being proactive, by being responsive, by being empathetic, and developing training programs that support policies, plans, and procedures to minimize risk and to educate the entire workforce, not just me at the low level, but up and down the organization.
And I have so many questions about that. But first, I want to start with the fact that we're even having this conversation, because when I knew we were going to talk about it, I'll be honest, it's been an interesting struggle for me.
Yeah.
And we sort of talked about this before the podcast started recording, which was, this is a problem. Like, I'm this Canadian guy, you're this American guy,
Yeah.
and we're having this conversation about violence in the workplace.
Yes.
Felix, does this, I mean, it must happen enough. You have a full time job doing this. First, let's maybe define what workplace violence is, because I know where my mind goes, but I want sort of an idea of what we're even talking about.
It's always good to frame the initiative. So I go by the OSHA definitions of workplace violence: fatal, non-fatal, violent, and non-violent. So non-violent are verbal abuse, name calling, harassment, whether it's sexual or things you do to annoy someone, intimidation, threats, shoving, pushing, and kicking and fighting. Those are all non-fatal, also described as violent. And then you have the violent fatal, which involves some type of a weapon or some type of an instrument that results in extreme physical injury and ensuing death results.
What is the state of workplace violence today? And I'm assuming you're talking about it from an American standpoint too.
Yes, yes. It's a trickling out of our boundaries, affecting the rest of the world. But I'll just focus in on the United States of America in terms of how I look at it and how I interpret what I see happening. So there are two perspectives. I call it the informed and the misinformed, trying to educate the uninformed. And by that I mean is everybody assumes that they know what workplace violence is and what workplace violence prevention is. But when you ask corporations how many have formal workplace violence prevention programs in place, about 30%, is the average norm of responses you get on surveys since 2006, for that matter. So there really isn't a devoted commitment or investment in workplace violence. So why is it an occurrence? This is an anomaly that me, through the experiences that I have garnered over the years, that I've discovered, and it isn't necessarily something that you'll find anywhere written. It's a theoretical, experience-based assessment, and that is, if you are walking down a city street and you bump someone's elbow, the natural response is, "Excuse me, I'm sorry." Right? In the workplace, if I do that, the natural response is, "You better not do that again." Why? Because there are rules and barriers and boundaries that prohibit the altercation from escalating. And so, therefore, if it escalates, even though I was the aggressor in my response, in my presentation, agitating the victim who accidentally bumped into me after I became the aggressor, once the victim crosses the line of civility, the aggressor claims assault. The aggressor claims battery. The aggressor claims he was harassed, threatened, and intimidated. So you see the complexities of it. The rules in the workplace actually creates the bully syndrome, actually creates the problem that results in the continuing unresolved, unabated conditions that exist because they use the system to perpetuate their non-existent problem, or the problem that they created, or the scenario that could have easily been resolved by people sitting across the table discussing their differences. So it's a complex mess in a complicated situation that becomes needlessly provoked by people who are playing games in an environment where union activity or management rules conflict and not work in an agreeable manner to resolve issues.
Is there also a resistance from organizations to even label it some violence? Because as you're saying, some of this is non-violent. So when I hear violence in the workplace, I'm picturing somebody punching somebody else in the face. But from your description, it can be very non-violent and verbal, or as you're talking, just being bumped into at work. So is there some organizations that might be resistance going, we don't need things in place because it's not to the level of MMA style?
The HR community, for whatever reasons they've decided, they like to sugarcoat the problem. They portray people like me as people that are desirous of creating more problems, developing more work that doesn't need to be developed. And so they focus in on the sugar-coated, nice and easy approach, which is a 10-question survey that employees never ever respond to honestly because they know where it's going into a file cabinet in olden days or into a database in modern days. So there isn't no genuine interest in that community, though sincere about tampering it down through zero tolerance, which I don't really call the workplace violence prevention. I call that the beginning of more problems, because zero tolerance is a legal structure that restricts managements in what they can do and can't do without their using creativity and innovation in pursuing the resolution. So until we can overcome those barriers, and HR truly believes it's not about the printing and the dissemination of policies and plans or procedures. It's about the education, and it's about the willingness and earnestness, if you would, making a new word, to convey a sense of compatibility in a workplace, regardless of what transpired. We're interested in the incident and the factors that contributed to the incident, not interested in disciplining the persons that were involved in the incident without first attaining all of the facts and circumstances. So I blame them, not maliciously, but because they're afraid of bringing someone in like me. They rather have a sugar-coated, like-minded individual who thinks like them, who responds to situations like them. I'm not like them. I 26 years as the United States Postal Inspector. I worked in an environment where the objective was solutions. We don't care where the pain falls. We just want solutions and identification of contributing factors. What are the risks? Elimination of the risk, and then the introduction of approaches that reduce risk. So I'm used to that environment. I sugarcoated my approach in the beginning. I'm not sugarcoating it anymore because people are dying. People do not want to come to work anymore because of toxic environments. People are tired of being intimidated. People are tired of being bullied and harassed by their supervisors, by coworkers. People are tired of reporting incidents and it falls into a waste paper basket that seems to be ignited with fire the minute the complaint gets into the file system. So you can understand the agitation and the emotion in these people who don't want to come to a traditional workplace because they're not receiving any value through their daily interactions with one another or with management.
Is there any industries, or I'm just trying to think of where this might happen more, whether it's frontline, C-suite, particular industries? Is there, does it lean a particular way, or is it just a problem across the board?
So with the fatal aspects of recording information, there is data to say policing, taxi cab drivers, truckers, and people who deal with the public, like 7-Eleven type stores that are exposed to violence from non-employees. In those environments, the risk of fatality or engaging in violent activities are much higher. In the workplace, while OSHA reports about 2 million annually of such incidents, I think from my engagement and my experience over the last 20 years in the corporate world, I think that number is much, much higher. And I'll tell you why I really believe that number is much, much higher. They suppress the data. It's a negative impact and a negative reflection on the organization. So they suppress the data. The data doesn't get properly reported. It doesn't get properly documented. Employees do not want to have a bullseye on their chest. So rather than reporting it, they internalize the experience and the exposure rather than becoming victims of the perpetrators or management. So they internalize it and they don't report it. And then you've got organizations that don't understand that there are two components to their work that deal with harassment. There's Title VII, which is discrimination in the workplace, that involves a litany of similar non-fatal behaviors that fall under workplace violence. So the HR professional who doesn't listen to a guy like me who is involved in the creation of ideas and thoughts and innovative approaches to violence prevention, who sees, hey, you've got all the stuff that's non-fatal, that's described by OSHA under your Title VII regarding employee harassments and intimidation by supervisors and the deprivation of opportunities for success and all that. But the same behaviors are also contributory under workplace violence, but only a little line that says anyone who engages in appropriate behavior will be dealt with appropriately, disciplined. If not disciplined, they will be, in addition to discipline, rather, they will be fired and eventually prosecuted. So there is confusion in the HR community that needs to be resolved, not necessarily from an antagonistic perception of my approach, but from a partnership. Hire a consultant to work with you to uncover and unravel the issues that are most near and dear to you that you may not understand.
So where do you start, Felix? First, it sounds like the organization needs to even understand that they want to acknowledge that there's a problem. So say that they do. Say that there is a problem with violence at all the levels that you've described, or one or a few. Needless to say, what is the first steps they need to take to even go down the path of rectifying these kind of situations? Is it getting into, oh, we even have a problem?
It's the admission rather than the omission. It's the admission of the possibility and the potential of something happening. And because of your arrogance, you never focused on the eventuality, and something did happen. Now you're on the witness stand, humming responses to questions that should have been answered before you got to that point. So I always say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, Russell. You know, you're a business leader. So in those positions of HR director, facility director, safety director, security director, you should be thinking not in a siloed fashion, but in a horizontal fashion, how you integrate. And that's my process, you know, integration, collaboration, coordination, communication, training, leadership, and execution. You know, how do you as a unit come together and share your knowledge so that we can collaborate in a way where the organization becomes more successful and in tune with the realities that they're about to face when there's a going, I hate to say this, postal, but I can because I'm a former postal inspector with good intentions, in a situation where you know there's a problem, But rather than addressing the problem and identifying the contributing members to that problem, you bury the problem, you issue a separation or termination notice to the employee who created the impression of being the problem employee. He or she leaves angrily. And do you think the problem is resolved? No. The workforce knows that due diligence was not applied. The workforce knows that you have no credibility. The workforce knows that you rubbed everything, you swept everything under the carpet, and you really didn't solve anything. You left it for us to deal with.
And I love that you mention the impacts to workplace culture. What are the impacts? I just want to dig into that a little bit more.
Yes.
As people think they're isolated incidents. Oh, this happened on that floor to those two people. We've quote unquote dealt with it. What are the ripples in the pond?
So if you look at it the way I do, from a tangible and from an intangible point of view, the tangibles are the things that I know can be measured: lost production, lost workplace efficiencies, increase in safety, reduction in productivity from the standpoint of employees who don't want to come to work, employees who will file injury compensation claims and claim stress as a result of the exposure to the harassment, the intimidation, the bullying, employees who will spend so much time out of work that the lost time at work directly impacts production performance, the morale and attitude of coworkers who know management isn't doing enough to take care of their coworkers' problems. And so the coworker now experiences angst and resentment and ostracization from the coworkers who know they're not the problem, but also know nothing is being done, and the workload now becomes their burden and their responsibility. So there's an organizational lack of identification of metrics that exist that they will push back on and say to me, it's hard to quantify it. My question to them is, how did you become who you are as a director or vice president if you can't quantify that people make a difference in the area of performance, production, and generation of results? How can you tell me you cannot come up with metrics? From an intangible perspective, psychologically, I'm traumatized. I can't understand why management, who is responsible for providing for a safe and secure workplace for me, can't do that. I'm afraid to come to work because every time I come to work, I'm being victimized and harassed. And when I report it, they want to know where my witnesses. No ensuing investigation to at least begin a process that identifies or controvert my complaint. So psychologically, I bear this trauma. I take this trauma that I experienced, that is a known reality of my workplace experience, is home to my family. My husband has to hear it. My wife has to hear it. My children have to hear it at the dinner table. And a real life story, husband says to the spouse, honey, I've heard this for a year. If you don't resolve it, I'm going to go in and take care of business myself. And invariably, family members take the gauntlet upon their shoulders because of the love they have for one another to find out what is going on there. So it's a tangible impact that can be measured through metrics. Then there's an intangible that also can be measured, but that adversely impacts the morale, the spirit of core, the health, the well-being of the employee, who becomes lackluster and unproductive.
That seems like this is the worst case scenario. Here are, as I said, all the ripples in the pond and the impacts. So to rewind it, say to the early days or maybe a couple years in for an organization, where is the CEO, the head of the organization? What are the red flags? What are the signs that they should be looking for that this is something that's starting to impact their organization or something they need to put protocols in place for?
That's a deep question. So I'll begin way out here in terms of where the ultimate burden of responsibility and accountability should begin, at the CEO level. But it's hard for that poor gal or poor guy to make the best decisions possible when they're under a mushroom cloud and not being given the facts, not being updated and kept informed, not briefed on what their need to know are, so that he can make or she can make the appropriate decisions in allocating resources, adjusting budgets, showing some commitment and some investment in his concerns for the problem. That's the warning signs, red flags that I would submit to you. The CEO needs to start driving and asking tough questions like, hey, Are we next in this embattled arena called workplace violence? How come I don't get these monthly or quarterly reports that are unadulterated, that are factual, that are honest, and that reflect what is happening? Let me see surveys of not culture surveys. Let me see a survey that says workplace violence prevention assessment survey, so that the employee connects with their realities to your desired expectations, so that the questions are appropriate and germane and relative. From an employee perspective, all this talk about warning signs really irked me, and I do this as part of my learning and dialogue and communications and training experiences. Whether the audience is 30 or 300, I'll say, okay, take a look at that slide. These are all the warning signs, and they'll say loss of a loved one, financial shortages, not able to pay bills, medical problems, argumentative, combative, disagreeable. And I'll say to the audience, just by looking at this, how many of those characteristics do you feel apply to you? And all the hands go up. It isn't the warning signs alone that should trigger an interest. It's the behaviors. It's the confrontational behavior that goes along with the warning signs. So if I am angry because the guy next to me gets a promotion, and I verbalize that anger, I can verbalize it all I want. It's when I cross the line of civility and start doing things that are caustic and toxic, like threatening, like engaging in inappropriate conduct, such as pushing and shoving, like being belligerent and combative, not following instructions, sabotaging property. Those are visible signs that can begin denoting to you that there's something wrong, as a warning sign that would give you the prerogative to go in and sit down with Felix and say, how can I help you? But we dismiss these because the employee witnesses who see their coworkers going through a bad marriage or a personal family issue are not going to, proverbial US reference, particularly out of New York, drop a dime on my coworker, because heck, any one of those warning signs could apply to me depending upon what side of the bed I wake up on. It's just how consistent and how engaging the individual who might be emitting or displaying those warning signs becomes as he takes on belligerence, combative, and argumentative styles that elevate to a point of concern.
You've been doing this for a while, Felix. Do you feel that it has increased? Any level of the violence in the workplace has increased, or is it about the same? Has been about the same for a while?
So I really don't know from a non-fatal perspective if the number of complaints have risen, because the number that we see every year is around 2 million that OSHA puts out annually. But I can also say to that, if that number is 2 million, there's a whole lot that under the surface that's not being reported. However, because we get media attention and local community news reporting to incidents of violence involving death or fatality or a fatal attack in the workplaces, those become more prominent and we become aware of them. Yes, those type of incidents involving fatalities in the workplace are going up more so than they've been in previous years, although FBI data seems to disagree with that number, and they do a great job at tracking it and saying workplace violence really is leveling off. What you hear more of are the violent incidents involving the fatalities in workplace involving multiple deaths, where someone with a automatic type of weapon comes in and not only shoots one person, but shoots, like in the Buffalo situation, 10, and another situation a couple of days ago, 14, 15, 16. So those kind of incidents are in the increase, but I can't really factually, other than what we're getting from OSHA, tell you factually just what's happening in workplaces, because their employees are always discouraged from reporting outside of their environments, but we know they report it to their doctors, their lawyers, their pastors, and their family members, and to local police before they report it internally.
You've jumped into it a few times and out of it, which is violence in the workplace, but it's not just employees. There's the violence of say you mentioned, say, a taxi driver and they have a violence of one of their customers. I assume it's treated differently from organizations because one, the employee is somebody they're responsible for, and two, a customer, well, that's something we'll address because it's not our responsibility. Do you find that?
Yes, Russell. I find that organizations address the workplace violence prevention initiative from an employee point of view. The healthcare does a great job in identifying the four categories that OSHA identifies. Violence from an employee, by an employee, violence from an opportunistic criminal that may engage in a robbery or an assault of an employee who's outside of their workplace, engage in work activities, a threat from a non-spousal, from a spousal or personal intimate relationship, and a customer, client, or patient interaction with an employee. So those four categories are really seen on a policy that gets supported by a plan, procedures, and training. It's always the focus on the employee. And OSHA has recognized this and has said your policy should be preventive oriented, not reactively oriented. In other words, give them examples of what each category is so that in the hearts and minds of their good intentions, when they're victims, they know what to report when they become a victim and recognize their victimization. When you create an environment where if spouses are having issues and one of them is your employee, create an empathetic, and that's a word that I use quite frequently because it doesn't exist in the leadership community. It seems that way. Create an empathetic environment where you can offer services to the employee who might be a victim of a caustic marital situation or family life situation, because they're not immune from that person coming in the back door, front door, or an unsecured door, coming in and exacting their vengeance on their spouses and on the way there are others that might be in their way. So the risks are huge when they don't know what to do. And so today, Russell, it kind of annoys me. The focus is on this thing called active shooter. Well, from a workplace standpoint, that active shooter was your employee or is your employee. How did that elevate to a point that that person became so angry that the natural instinctive response was violence to such an extreme? That tells me something failed between your hiring and the termination that created that caustic feeling in the hearts and mind of that employee to come back in and exact their vengeance in that fashion. Something is wrong with leadership. Something is wrong with management. Something is wrong with their understanding of what an ounce of prevention is all about in terms of commitment to safety and security, an investment in safety and security of people's well-being while they're with you, so they understand that they want you to come back, go home safely and come back safely.
So I want you to be magic, Felix. I want you to have, close your eyes and envision an organization that's doing this correctly. What does that look like? An organization that embraces that they have a role to play in preventing violence in the workplace. What protocols are in place? What processes are in place? What does that look like?
I believe the missing link in the chain of strength, continuity of purpose, and success in the execution of a workplace violence prevention program is communication. I believe the lack of communication and the lack of management commitment and investment in ensuring that the word gets out from the top down so that there's trust, confidence, and credibility from the bottom up is missing. I do not believe, in my world, I would like a world where you have someone that has, depending upon the size of your organization, has an appointed duty responsibility of workplace violence prevention manager or workplace violence prevention coordinator embedded in your title somehow or another. And then someone that is in areas where they don't have the luxury of that kind of a person, someone who is ultimately responsible for it throughout the organization. So that person can be viewed as the direct contact between them and the CEO when it comes to allocation of resources and budgeting. And an organizational response not an HR only response or a safety or training individual response or a security response, because each have independent and different duties and roles and responsibilities. An organizational response aligned with policies, plans, procedures, training, execution, and leadership that recognizes what the organization's objectives are, and that there is an investment based on a process of identifying problems that come to their attention, not haphazardly, not because of favoritism, not because of a stand-in policy that says we have to invoke zero tolerance because Felix crossed the line of civility, but one that engenders creativity, innovation, and that does have, like some vision statements say, we treat you as the most important resource in our organization, Mr. or Miss Employees. Believe that and live that by the demonstration of your interest in their health and welfare that contributes to the success of the organization.
Would you say that this is mostly a medium to large organization problem, or is it something that also small organizations should be very aware of?
I think it goes from the small organizations right up to the top. I think every one of them, regardless of the size, should have their appropriate response to their workplace violence initiative. Small organizations are no less vulnerable than mid-sized or large organizations. In fact, Russell, small organizations make assumptions based upon the family orientation that dismisses rules and barriers. And the vernacular is less than formal and less than professional, if you know what I'm referring to.
Absolutely.
In medium,
Absolutely.
right? In medium organizations, and I've worked with many of them, well-intended, earnest, desirous of creating the right environments, but lack the resources. And in that realm, in my experiences, have reached out to me to be their gap in the chain to help them create that strength in that chain, create credibility, confidence, and trust. Large organizations have large organization problems, even though they're well structured and have well informed, well educated individuals to run those programs, because they're siloed. They're not horizontally aligned to talk to one another, as I would recommend, monthly around a table to discuss issues regarding threat assessment and threat management, so that from a workplace violence prevention perspective, all of the entities in the organization at the senior level are aware and have some sort of understanding of what's going on, what's being done to ameliorate or mitigate the escalation of the problem. So larger organizations, they mask their workplace violence behaviors in different fashions under bullying. They call it leadership and managing of resources, but they're actually designed to intimidate people, keep people in their places, deny them their desires because you didn't do something right for me, or I don't like you, so I'm going to deny you a weekend that's tied to a Monday holiday opportunity for you. So there's different levels of risk factors and warning signs that exist through different levels of our organizations.
So, say somebody's listening to this podcast and they're thinking, okay, what do I do right now? Because maybe their organization isn't giving them the full picture. Maybe their HR team is sugarcoating everything, but there is somebody that actually wants change, but they don't know where to start to understand the problem or understand where to even begin. What would you tell that person?
I think to begin, if you're hearing me now, I would encourage a self-assessment of your organization.
I want to ask if you have any scenarios or stories that you can share, obviously without revealing details for privacy, but any stories that you remember sharing with a CEO or C-suite that really changed their mind about how important addressing violence in the workplace is, like almost giving them their aha moment. Is there anything you can share?
Yes. This is one that I share all the time, because the HR director is the consummate HR director. And the CEO of that original client moved on to another company, and he and I are best of friends. I know his children, I know his spouse. From that experience, productive manager was suddenly having problems at work and was beginning to alienate the workers in the office. Concerned about these reports, the HR director collaborated with the other managers to elicit additional information that she needed to arrive at the best approach, right way of doing it. She wanted to understand what was going on and received glowing feedback about this manager's past work performance and this manager's contributions to the workplace, and his employee engagement skills were superior. Concerned about this positive feedback she was getting about this individual, she decided that she was going to bring him in and not approach it from the accusatory perspective, but from we received these complaints that I don't believe, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. Discovering that at home he was going through some issues and did not know how to cope, and the missus instructed him that he needed to take personal responsibility for his personal condition and was to seek psychiatric evaluation. Upon seeking psychiatric evaluation, he was issued medication. And while he was on the medication, he performed well. But while off the medication, he had issues in coping and managing his own behavior that rose to a level of concern for the workforce, so much that he began to isolate himself from the office environment. That's when I was invited to assist them and assess and evaluate to see if I could offer any recommendations emanating from my assessment. On the day that I was supposed to be there, I get a phone call, and it was an urgent phone call, and that was a coworker that normally takes a smoke break on the roof of the building, of their office building, went on the roof to take his smoke break, and his friend was on the ledge about to jump. And he talked him off the ledge, and that's my involvement. Now, the good thing about this is that when I got involved and went through the process that I used to get at the root causes and come up with the framework of knowledge that will allow me to bring all the parties in and have some big boy and big girl conversations with, it all worked out well at the end of the week when the employee who was sitting across from me and addresses this statement to the HR director. You see, if people had spoken to me and understood that I was a human being and was thoughtful and caring enough, like Mr. Nater has been these past several days, maybe we would never be in this situation where I'm telling him everything that I could have told my immediate vice president, who didn't care about asking. He only cared about accusing. So a bad situation that ended in a positive situation. He was separated from the organization voluntarily, giving a nice financial package. We have maintained contact over the years. He's doing exceedingly well. And so I'm very, very happy. I do not share that with my friend, the HR director, or my friend, the CEO. I just merely say, when they ask me, he's doing fine. And thank you for having invited me in to be a part of that solution.
Thank you so much, Felix. Really appreciate that. It's if we say violence in the workplace, but I mean really to understand it from the human level, that these are people having challenges and problems, and it's what we can control of how we react to it and address things that we need to really pay attention to.
That's right.
So
right. It's really physical violence and psychological violence, right? When you think about it, you know, a person who comes to work every single day and is the victim of workplace violence is suffering psychologically because they need their job, want their job, enjoy their job. And the minute they report it, their whole world changes. So it's truly psychological and traumatic.
thank you for reinforcing that. So the last question, Felix,
Yes,
so
sir.
we can wrap up our time together. And thank you so much for sharing your brain with me. What's one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
So I think empathy will answer the question for you. Being empathetic means being understanding, being thoughtful, being considerate, not taking things for granted, not being assumptive, listening. Empathy is missing from our world today. Leaders have to accept their roles and functions in adjudicating people problems. We are not mental cases. And those of us that are suffering from mental illness are afraid to come forward because we're going to be maligned and labeled. But those of us that are suffering from mental health issues are not the violent ones that you see on the news media. We're the ones who are trying to deal with our situations the best way we can and receive the treatment that we can and deal with our personal lives and employment life in the best way we possibly can. So leadership who understands the importance of empathy in their administration of their duties and responsibilities.
That's Felix Nater. He's a workplace violence prevention advisor and consultant and president and owner of Nater Associates, a human resources security management consulting practice. Felix, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Russell. Have me back again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You bet.